All right, so this is the same source sheet we used last week. This is just a piece from Rav Dessler that we didn't get to. So he starts off, just to jump right into it, he starts out by saying, talking about, again, our actions and how that connects with how we think about things with our intellect and how we feel things in our heart. So he says, "Amaisim mivtoim is madregas ha'adam hapnimis." Our actions can sort of show what's going on inside of us. Umachshavas tavos she'in ha'adam mivin lidei ma'isa biyadu she'inam lefi madregaso ha'mitis. And he says that sometimes our actions, sometimes we do something good, but they don't always necessarily reflect where we're holding, right? There's this idea of what madrega you're on, where you're holding. And he says that actions don't always tell us the true story or reflect exactly where we're truly holding, deep inside. So let's see how he develops this. He says, nevertheless, really what we have to think about is not so much the action, but where they stem from, and that's working in ourselves to purify our heart, because that is where the actions ultimately, come from. The Medrash in on Tehillim says, "Umodev ozev Yerucham," that when you are moda, you give thanks, you leave, and then you are and you will have rachamim, right? You have mercy. So what does that mean? Moda al minas ve'ozev Yerucham. So the Medrash says that it means that you have to be moda in order to leave, and then you'll be Yerucham. Harei shahoda al ha'emes shehi etzem havidui imhi be'ofen aroi lahavi laziva sachet b'maisa. If you are moda sincerely, and that leads you to leave chet with the actions that you take, klomar shehi amiti supnimis, az hi nechshavas leikar umevia kvar es harachamim. That will bring you the rachamim from Shemayim, from Hashem. Aziva atzma bepoel hina rak birur lamitis haoda halevu shoresh hamayse v'koveya samadrega. And he says that the actions that we take are simply a reflection of what's really going on inside of us. So you say, "Efo sheyesh hevdelim mechrim be'erchem shomaysim." So he says, what we can see from, what we can really derive is that not every action is equal. Shelo nidnu libachin la'ayin hachitzonis, and sometimes you can't really tell, when you're just sort of looking at what somebody is doing, or even looking at what we ourselves are doing. It's not always easy to tell what's really going on inside of us. Because this is all really dependent on where we are holding inside. If So if we are truly holding in the right place inside of us, meaning that we really see what the truth is, the truth of the world, we're putting things into our proper perspectives, and we're putting our own desires into proper perspective, that's the root of the maisim that become a mitzvah lishma. Then we're going to be doing things lishma. But sometimes, when inside of us, we're still looking after ourselves and looking after our own kavod, other desires, etc. That will also be the root of the actions that we take, and that's going to lead to an action that might look good on the surface, but it's really a shalol lishma. And we can't tell the difference. But still, you have the same action taken by two different people. One of them might be very much a ben olam haba, and the other person is very far from it because they still have work to do. Okay. So seichel v'leiv. So he's going to further develop this into how the intellect and the heart sort of come together. So then b'koach haseichel, He says we don't have our intellect itself is not enough to help us sway or help us go into the proper direction, the direction of emes. He says the intellect is always sort of going after how we feel inside in our hearts. Misha libo bocher be'emes gam das sichlo yeshara. If we inside in our hearts we are able to recognize the emes, then our intellect is going to follow that same path, and it'll be a path of the straight, of the righteous. And our actions are going to go after our heart and our intellect. And if our heart is really connected to our own desires, whatever they may be for each of us individually, the intellect will go after that as well. And he says that he says that that's really the root of when we think about how we sometimes will rationalize. So maybe he doesn't give this example, but maybe if we take an example of someone who feels like, the rules, whatever it is, our rule doesn't apply to me, and this is why. Maybe it's, I'm okay if I cheat a little bit here, I don't declare this to the IRS, whatever it is. How does that work? How does that work inside of us? The intellect sort of rationalizes it, but the only reason why the intellect is rationalizing it is because inside our own hearts, we've sort of decided that, what's more important to me is my own desires. And so then the intellect just goes after that and helps us to rationalize it and to put a nice bow around it. It says, whatever it is that's driving you inside, the intellect is going to make this rationalization, this decision, based on where the heart is holding. If So he says that the reason for this is that your heart has already sort of decided what's really important to you, what's the driving force. Perhaps you feel like, going back to our example of maybe cheating on taxes or something like that. You feel like, this is my money. I don't want to part with it. And then your own seichel will sort of follow suit. But he says that it's not that there is some kind of a connection or one has to lead to the other. It's simply that once you have this sort of eights in your heart, then it sort of follows that's the way it follows, so that we can sort of, I guess, live with what the direction we want to go. And this is going to be hidden from you. Because nobody wants to look at themselves in the mirror and say, I'm a liar, I'm a cheat, I'm a whatever. The seichel is giving you these rationalizations so that you feel like, no, this is okay, right? This is the way this is proper, or this is whatever it is, or the whatever the rule doesn't apply to me, or doesn't apply because of X, Y, and Z, etc. And interestingly, he sort of brings in this idea, and we have it. It's funny. It's one of those old ideas that I think sort of go between different languages. It's different times. We say things like, I can feel it in my kishkas, right? Or I have my gut tells me something, right? It's
or my kidneys. This is kidneys,
right. Yeah, kleos or kidneys. Yeah, for sure. I'm just sort of thinking, more colloquially how we think about things, right? I feel my gut. Like that's usually we don't say I feel it in my kidneys, but I might say I feel it in my gut, or I feel it in my kishkas, or I feel like, right. So what does that mean?
Well, we always said, the kidneys were the smartest organ in the body.
So this is where he's going with it. Exactly. And sometimes we feel like, or perhaps we might feel like, no, this is really, I really feel something deep inside that this is really the MS. And he's saying that it's not necessarily something that we can rely upon. So he says, "Higam hem mustaros eishem bechalal haguf b'derech halal lo tizkarena v'lo tifkedena v'al kein tishmashena tamid sama l'shar shehem nistarim shal hamaisim." He says that this is also something that sort of gets buried within us, and sometimes it also is hidden from our own actions. Another medrash, Ani Hashem choker leiv ubochin klayus. Right, the pasuk in Yirmiyahu says, "I am Hashem. I can discern the heart of a person. I can and what's going on in their kidneys." Lama mazkir hu es halev es haklayos. Why the leiv and the klayos? Because shar ha'ivarim, as opposed to some other part of our body. Ela heinayim holchim achar halev, as naim holchim achar halev. He says our eyes go after what we feel in our heart, our ears after what's in our heart. V'ramach ivarim holchim achar halev. In everything, we go after what's in our heart. Lefisha klayos yotzes achar halev, and he says the klayos too are simply being informed by the leiv, the halev gomer. Lefichach inu mazkir ela osan halev gomer perish la'achriya la'maisa. And the leiv is really what drives our actions. V'klayos yotzes achar halev perish achar shekvar haya ratzon halev. Once the leiv is sort of, I guess, made its decision, or once we feel like this is what is important to me, what I desire, everything is going to go after that, even those gut feelings, those intuitions, those instincts that we have, everything sort of goes after what's going on in our hearts. So now he's gonna continue to develop this idea and what it means for us, and what it means for us is, in terms of where we are all holding, because this is something that we all struggle with. So he says, Matzavo hapnimi shel ha'adam alo lishtanos mizman lizman. He says, what's going on deep inside of us is going to change. In other words, how we feel about things, how we look at things, that will change from time to time. Pam lalos, pam laredas. Sometimes, we're on the upswing, and sometimes we're going down a little bit. But it's always within a specific area, he says. So when we think about what madrega are you holding on, where are you holding in life, he says it's not like it's a fine line, it's a shetach, it's an area, but it's a very specific one, and it has guardrails, there's rails on either side. Kivano hapnimi v'rekshi levavo olulim lisnoneim bebechinas gadlus demochin v'yisor roshal kedushas lebechinas kadnus demochin v'yerida v'chozer chalila. So he brings in these ideas of, as he does once in a while, these ideas of Kabbalah, gadlus demochin, kadnus demochin. I don't really understand those concepts, but I think what he's saying is that it all sort of fits with this idea that you have this shetach, you have this area that you sort of end up bouncing between, and that's captured in this idea as well. Yom echad chosheku b'limud Torah or b'maisa mitzvos u'macharasahu misrape. He says one day we feel very inspired to learn, to do mitzvahs, to whatever it is, but then the next day sometimes we feel a little like weakened from that. We don't feel quite as inspired. We don't feel quite as energetic about these things. So he says, madrega l'maisa lo nishtana. But we should realize your madrega hasn't changed. Like where you're holding hasn't changed. Shaharihu chozer la'osam hakvatzos pa'amim rabos, because you are going to continue going between those two sort of boundaries of this area that you're holding within for a while. And he quotes the Sefer HaYashar, that you can look into this even further. Nimsa shetzarich lahagdir kol madrega lo kekav ela keshetach shebein shnei kvatzos ha'elyon v'atachtot shebinehem misnoos hakaraso V'his chazkuso haruchanis. And this is where you're going to be sort of bound in between these within the madrega that you're holding. So this is a karas alev madrega tlus zubizu. So therefore, he now connects this to what we were saying earlier. So what's going on in your heart is going to be connected to your madrega, and they're dependent on each other. So he says that we have to realize that because of that, what we recognize, how we feel, is going to be dependent on where that is, where it is that we're holding. So he says, "Ulefi mashin is bara achshav yeshnam havdelim bebehiras ha'reia besoch shetach madrigasenu kagam b'madrigas hagezal." So he says too. So let's take an example and try to understand this. So he says, let's take the madriga of gezel when we think about stealing. So anu makirim hetiv begriya shel gezel mamish, right? When we think of true mamish theft, we understand how bad that is, right? Going into, I don't know, taking something that doesn't belong to us, going to somebody's house, taking somebody else's possessions. We all realize that's a really sort of low level to fall into. But once we look at maybe ona meaning the problem of perhaps overcharging or something like that, and then we may, depending on where we are, that may be a struggle for us. We may not see it perfectly well. So maybe if we, trying to use an example, maybe if we own a business or something and we're looking at how much we should charge for something, that's now we might have more of a gray area, and we don't look at that perhaps the same way as we did when we thought about gezel of taking something physical from somebody else. So again, he says, ish k'fi matzavasav nisyonasav. He says this is all going to be dependent on each individual, where they're holding and what their nisyonos are, what they do. But minaso shel Rav Safra anu roim kvar rak chasidus yisera. So the Gemara in Bava Basra talks about when you have to take meiser. So if you buy, let's say you buy fruit, you're in Israel, you buy fruit, you have to take meiser on it. But you only have to take meiser when you've made the kinyan on it. So the Gemara says that Rav Safra, because of where he held his madrega, he felt that even once he had thought, you know what, I'm going to buy that bushel of apples, as soon as that came into his mind, he said, I'm already chayav to take meiser on it, even though I haven't even made a kinyan on it yet. I'm already chayav. That's where he was holding. So that's obviously a very high level, and that's not necessarily where everybody else is going to be feeling, but that's where he was. We may not feel that same chiyuv that he felt, because that's where he's holding, that's not where we're holding. So the Gemara in Brachos says, when we darshans out that posuk in Tehillim, that to Hashem is, Hashem owns the land and everything that's within it. So the Gemara says, so anybody who gets hana from the world, it's as if they have used something for hektish for something, they profaned something that was for hektish. So ad she yatiru lo hamitzvos. Oh, kol hanena mina olam hazeh below bracha gilu gozel la kodesh baruch hu knesset Yisrael. Or anybody who takes hana from this world without a bracha. So I pick up an apple and I eat it. I don't make a bracha. And the Gemara says that it's as if I have stolen from Hashem and from all of Israel, Knesset Yisrael, from all the Jewish people. Gazela kazu gavar ein anu margishim klal. Like, do we even have any feeling that that's what we're doing? Like, if we forget to make a bracha or something, do we really feel like I've now stolen from all of the Jewish people because I didn't make a bracha? It's probably not something that we ourselves feel, just because that's not, it's not shaykh to us. It's not where we're holding. Because this is all, again, going to go back to this area, the shetach of where we're holding of what madrega we're holding in. Yeshna shetach acher hamocher lanu beriya kahe bioso karav lekotzahel yanshal madragasanu. So again, it's all going to be dependent on where we are and how we see that, we don't have necessarily our eyesight sort of dims when we look at something that's just way above us. We just don't. It's not something that we can understand or relate to. He says sometimes we have an intellectual concept of that, right? We can intellectually think about a Rav Safra or this Gemara in Brachos. We can intellectually try to grapple with it and see if we can, but it's not in our heart yet. And it's not quite in our heart. He says that's what we mean by a re'iyah, that our eyesight is a little bit dimmed. Like we can only see it a little bit. We don't get a complete picture of it. It's not clear to us. And because of that, our actions are not going to be are not strengthened by that. In other words, they're not going to be led by us, as if we had really understood those madrigas, and so it's not going to affect our actions because it's not where we are. It's not in our heart yet. Because again, our actions are always going to be defined by the top and the bottom boundaries of the area of our madriga. So what is already developed in our heart, that is where we're going to be, right? That's what we can rely on, and that's what our actions are going to be derived from. And sometimes we make a mistake because intellectually we learn something, we see a Rav Safra, and we're inspired to it, but our madrega is not there yet. And so we made the mistake that we are there when we're not there. But then we see how it weakens over time because it's only an intellectual conception. It's not really inside of us. And then it becomes something that becomes forgotten to us. He says, even though that sometimes so for somebody who it is clear in their seichel, so anybody who's clear in their seichel that everything that we do comes from the ashkacha of Hashem. So how do we tie that in? That everything that happens to us, everything that's going on, also is from hashkacha pratis, and you can feel this at the time that you are inspired. That inspiration is Hashem talking to us, is Hashem having a relationship with us. And even so, when we feel that it's starting to wane because it's not really part of where we're holding, then we start to think, this is just derech hateva, right? We start to feel like, we're disconnected from Hashem. I'm not inspired. It's not really there. It's really just, this is just nature. It's just happenstance, etc. And sometimes that's sort of the direction that we go, as well as that we sort of lose where we're holding, or we think about, I'm not. But really, it's not that Hashem is the relationship. The Hashgacha is not there, etc. It's simply that we're not holding in that place. It's an interesting insight into our relationship and really understanding ourselves. So so now he's connecting it back, and then we only have a couple more minutes, but now he's connecting it back to something that of Bechira and Bechira's Chosh. That I don't know if you remember, we looked at this maybe a year and a half ago, so it's been a while. But Rav Dessler has had a whole piece on Bechira. And what is Bechira? What is the free choice that we have? And he was talking about, he used the example of a smoker. And he said that really what Bechira is that it's sort of like the line, the front line of a war. you've gathered so much territory, and so anything that's behind the front line is no longer in the war. Right? You're no longer fighting over that territory. That means that for me, it's no longer a battle. So for me, maybe turning on and off a light on Shabbos, that's no longer a battle. Maybe it was once upon a time, but it certainly isn't now because it's behind me. But sometimes that line, that front line can move, and sometimes you have a retreat, and sometimes something that wasn't a battle for you becomes a battle. So that was his whole thing. And he was talking about how for a smoker that, you can start the morning off saying, oh, I feel horrible. I'm not smoking today. It's making me feel terrible. And by the time you start getting those pings again that you want to smoke, so that same idea that that's where your front line is. Your front line is really about that, can I give up smoking or can I not? Or whatever it is, that whatever challenge that we all have individually. But now what he's doing is saying that front line is really not just a front line, not just a line, it's an area. And that's the area of Bechira, and that also is the area of the Madrega that we're on. So as we move forward with where we're holding in our Madrega, it's also where our Bechira is, meaning that once our challenge is no longer turning on or off that light on Shabbos, that's no longer, right? We're beyond that Madrega. We've moved on to a new Madrega. But it's not a line. It's an area that we're going to sort of go back and forth. Some days we feel stronger about it. Some days we're struggling a little bit with it, but it's still that same Madrega. So unfortunately, we didn't get to finish this, although we're pretty close. But I just, to me, this is just an amazing sort of development of this idea of what starts in our heart, how it affects how we think about things, how we intellectualize, how we rationalize, and how we think about ourselves, like spiritually and religiously as well, all comes down to this idea of what's going on in our hearts and what, sort of where we're holding, and the idea that we should be always be trying to grow and try to do more. And we always have to realize that where somebody else is holding, like a Rasafra, that's not where we are. Maybe someday, but it's not where we are, and it's not until it's within our hearts that it's really sort of solidified in our heart that it becomes part of who we are.